Marlowe is the one that recruited Cobb into the orphanage organization. And now that Cobb is in the orphanage, Cobb does seem to always be trying to do the right thing, which is why I wonder how this is actually all going to play out when Cobb learns that his uncle is the big bad in this show, possibly. What is up, everybody? Here to talk about episodes 3 and 4 of the Copenhagen Test Season 1. We're coming off the first 2 episodes, which has set up this complicated plot, really, and we have a lot of characters that the show still has to develop. And as these next 2 episodes, episode 3 and 4, went along, I kind of saw why the show was getting some bad reviews, although I wouldn't say it's necessarily bad reviews, but the show's not getting good reviews from what I've read online. I still like it overall, but I will say my big problem is that it hasn't gotten to that next level yet. Like, the show is very much sci-fi. The show is a spy show, but I wouldn't call it a thriller because it doesn't really leave you on the edge of your seat. I've seen people call it a slow burn, and that's not a bad thing because the show does have many characters to try to develop and make us care about not only them, but this big old plot in general. Episode 3 was actually a pretty good episode, though. It was episode 4 that I got a little irritated, but we'll get to that. In episode 3, we start with the character St. George, which is the name of basically the head of the orphanage operation. She has been heading up this operation since its inception, and we learned in the first 2 episodes that the orphanage had never been hacked into for all these decades until now, and she had basically been waiting for that moment to happen. Now she doesn't have to worry about that happening anymore. But we get some development with St. George here. We get a flashback of her digging in a garden. Seems like she is doing gardening work until this other older lady comes out with a gun, threatening her, saying that her husband's going to come back soon. But St. George is able to talk the woman down and stay inside with her, and we learn that the woman is actually St. George's wife, who is currently suffering from dementia, or at least 2 years ago with this flashback, she's suffering from dementia. And obviously St. George has to calm her down until the moment her wife becomes lucid again and is able to think clearly again. But obviously the dementia is taking a toll on both of these women. Clearly we get to see St. George's love for her wife, but then the woman starts to freak out when she sees the book, which is the book that St. George dug up from the garden. The woman freaks out, not liking it in the house, and that's when we see the book has a list of names and places on individual pages, dates as well. And St. George flipped a page and wrote down Alexander Hill's name. That book would come into play later, although I'm still unclear as to why St. George was writing Alexander's name in the book and what the book was used for with her, although we kind of get there in a while. We'll get to that, though. One thing I wish the show was doing a better job of, and it's probably my main complaint, is that the whole hook to the show is that Alexander Hill has this chip in his brain and it's getting hacked. But outside of a brief period in the first episode, we really rarely see what the hacker is seeing through Alexander. It happens a couple more times in these 2 episodes, but I feel like it should be something that the show is showing us more of, because it's quite literally the best concept in the show. But the show has decided to give us all these backstories for all these separate characters going on, which, as I said earlier, I do think the show needs to do that because they do have these side characters, And of course, it's a typical spy show where we have to guess who can and cannot be trusted. So in order for us to care about who can and cannot be trusted, we do need to either get backstory for the characters or see character development. But in only 8 episodes, it's hard to pull everything together. And I think that's why the show is coming off as just okay, getting some mediocre to poor reviews out there. They're trying to do a lot in one season, and we're not going to get every question answered, which shouldn't happen in a first season. But these shows can't fall into the Lost trap, like the show Lost, which has all these things happening, has the audience asking all these questions. They don't know how to answer all the questions because they never really thought through everything they were doing, and it cheats the audience of that in the end. That's what Lost did. Lost to me is like the most overrated series of all time because of that. Anyways, back to this. The Orphanage has learned that the only reason Alexander started to become hacked was because of the pills his ex-wife was giving him for his headaches. So they have to figure out if his ex-wife, Rachel, knew what the pills exactly were and that they were going to get Alexander hacked. By episode 4, they seem to think that's not the case. Alexander and Michelle's relationship continues to develop. And at this point in time, Michelle is still playing Alexander, despite her revealing the truth about who she is and that she was the woman in the woods from episode 1. She still is trying to con Alexander, and Parker is still the character walking her through that a lot because they just need Michelle to keep Alexander close because they still don't necessarily trust him. The big deal about this episode is that the Orphanage knows that they need to basically sacrifice a project so that they can still be giving the hackers intel and allow the hackers to still believe that they don't know that Alexander is hacked. So that was what this episode was mostly about. And Parker and the others had to come up with a way to sacrifice a project, even though there would be casualties on their own side. Now, Cobb becomes another character that is developed in episode 3 more. We get to see how unhappy he is with his distrust for Alexander, and he thinks that Alexander is possibly the leak within the Orphanage. He goes to Marlo, which is another character we haven't discussed too much here in my reviews, but she's one of the heads in the Orphanage, not the main head like St. George, but definitely up there, along with Mora, who is her male counterpart in being one of the heads trying to contain this situation. When Cobb goes to Marlo about his distrust of Alexander, Marlo basically gets upset with Cobb, thinking he has more info than the higher-ups. She tells Cobb that they're already onto Alexander, they've checked everything out, and that he is to be trusted because only the heads of this operation know that Alexander has been hacked, and they're still trying to give him not only fake projects, but all of these projects that are even compromised so that they can keep the hack open so that the hacker doesn't learn that Alexander and others within the organization know he is hacked. As we talked about in the last review, Cobb always likes to talk to his uncle about some of the stuff going on in the Orphanage, and he tells his uncle that he thinks he's the only one with concerns about certain personnel. But what Cobb should be concerned with is that we learn in this episode that Cobb's uncle is indeed the hacker. And so this creates the question of, is Cobb the real leak within the Orphanage? I mean, you wouldn't think so because of the way he's acting. He's trying to do the right thing here with his distrust for Alexander. But with his uncle being the actual hacker, it makes you question Cobb because of that. So they set up the big project that they have to sacrifice, which means there will be casualties on their own side. Parker gets some development here because she does not like seeing the death as they are watching this on their screens. Earlier in the episode, Michelle also talked to Parker about this, telling Parker that she needs to keep telling herself that she's not responsible for the deaths that are about to happen. Parker at that point didn't feel responsible for the deaths that are about to happen, but when she sees it play out on screen, she obviously feels bad about it. The mission actually went even worse because of the ambush that happens, and so everyone on the project is pretty upset about it. Cobb was the one that was trying to interfere with the project going sideways, so he ends up getting some of the blame for the ambush. But this was just the orphanage's way, or the heads of the orphanage, trying to make Cobb trust Alexander, because Cobb and Alexander were the two with the info, and they were together a lot during this project. So now they're hoping that Cobb trusts Alexander and will get off their asses with this whole thing. Now, as we talked about last time, the end of episode 2 saw Alexander's only real friend, Victor, who was Alexander's mentor, talking to Cobb's uncle again, telling Cobb's uncle that Alexander is too trusting and too loyal, and that worries him about Alexander involved with the orphanage. I believe Schiff is the name of Cobb's uncle, and when they meet in secret again, Victor wants Schiff to check with Cobb on whether he should be worried about Alexander at work. Schiff won't help Victor with this, though, saying he and Cobb don't discuss what's going on in the orphanage. We know that to be a lie, though, because we see that Cobb is always giving his uncle information with their talks. But we are left to wonder why Victor and Schiff are so close. Episode 3 ends with Alexander and Michelle continuing to get closer. They meet in a church, and she takes him down into catacombs because the signal with the chip in his brain will be blocked again, and it will allow them both to speak freely, not only so the hackers don't hear them, but even the people in the orphanage won't be able to hear them. I do like that when they are being watched, Michelle and Alexander talk in Morse code by tapping what they want to say on each other. That's a good way for the show to have Michelle and Alexander have this closer relationship. And at this point, it does seem like Michelle maybe is actually falling for him, maybe even siding with him as she gives him more info as they speak freely. Alexander trusts Michelle with this. She could also just be doing this to get more info out of him, which she does get more info out of him. He tells her that they have to win whatever it takes. Now that he's involved with this mission, they gotta win the mission. To circle back to the book that St. George had at the beginning of episode 2, she ends up bringing it to Parker because she saw how Parker was struggling with seeing the losses and the murders take place on video. She tells Parker that the book is for things that you can't carry. She encourages Parker to basically write it down in the book and then bury it literally and try not to dig it back up. So we saw at the beginning that I guess St. George used to write down things that were bogging her down or things that she can't carry in a hope to forget about that sorrow and bury the book, but clearly she always dug up the book a lot. By the end of episode 3, it is clear that Cobb's uncle Schiff is the real person behind the hack, and he is onto the fact that it's only a matter of time before Alexander realizes that he's compromised. And so now he wants to use someone close to Alexander as leverage for when that happens. Will that be Victor? That's a big question. Could it end up being Michelle? I don't know. I guess we'll find out when we get there. I will say something the show has to do better of, and we'll see if that happens. But I'm about to start talking about episode 4, and I'm going a little long here, so it's probably going to be a quick recap of episode 4. But I wish they would develop the friendship between Victor and Alexander better, because while we're getting good development for Parker and Michelle, they get a lot of screen time. We had good development with St. George in episode 3. We've yet to really have that development with Victor. We know that he's Alexander's friend and someone that helped him at work when he still worked for the organization, but we don't really get those flashbacks like we've gotten others. And so it kind of makes me care less about their friendship when they're just telling us about their friendship and not exactly showing us. Now, episode 4 develops Cobb more clearly. We get a flashback of 5 years ago when he was working for a senator, and the senator was upset with him because he was accusing Cobb of leaking a draft because apparently Cobb might have been trying to get ahead and be the golden boy, and so the senator fired him. And when he left the senator's office, that's when Cobb ran into Marlowe, and we learned that Marlowe is the one that recruited Cobb into the orphanage organization. And now that Cobb is in the orphanage, Cobb does seem to always be trying to do the right thing, which is why I wonder how this is actually all going to play out when Cobb learns that his uncle is the big bad in this show, possibly. Episode 4 had more action than some of the first 3 episodes. We know we had that library scene in episode 2, which was still one of my favorite scenes of the first 4 episodes so far. Traveler 2005 in the comments pointed out that the choreography and the camera work in the big bookstore sequence with the action was really clean, and I agree. Some of the complaints I see from the reviewers that I've read was that the show lacks action, which for a show like this, maybe it does need more, but like with What Time, we have this big plot to develop with all these different characters. They like asking us who we can and cannot trust. I can see why some action has been missing from like episode 3 and 1, even though we did get the death scenes in episode 3. We get more action in this episode 4, because Parker comes up with a plan so that Alexander can draw out this person with info. That's what most of episode 4 is about. But I actually felt like the action in this episode kind of made episode 4 my least favorite episode so far, because at this point in the middle of season 1, Alexander's not going to die. And so it kind of lessens the stakes in this episode when these killers are after Alexander and the man he's trying to get a encrypted disk out of, because the man might have info on who the real mole is within the organization. But even though Parker's worried because they can't send people to help Alexander, they can't send him back up too soon because it will be too obvious to the hackers. I just never thought Alexander was going to die or even be hurt in this episode, and he wasn't. What episode 4 did do good, though, was obviously developing Cobb. Like I said, he continues to want to figure out the truth of what's going on in the orphanage, why they aren't worried about certain things, why he's feels like he's being lied to, which he is. He uncovers info that he is being lied to. He goes to his old boss, the senator, in hopes of getting a meeting with the CIA. And by the end of the episode, it looks like Cobb is going to do that. So Cobb is the character that is doing a lot of digging, even going against the higher-ups in the orphanage. And they did a good job in this episode of showing us that this is who Cobb is. He did this with his old job. He's doing it again here. And obviously Marlowe liked that about Cobb when she brought him into the organization. But what does his uncle play in this? Like, where does his uncle play into Cobb's life? And obviously he's the hacker, so that's one of the more interesting things to find out as I go along here. They develop Michelle and Alexander's relationship as the two make love in this episode. So they have definitely dived into the romance between Michelle and Alexander. And they also gave us a backstory on Michelle here when this man from her past turns up. This is another reason why I said that the show is trying to do maybe too much sometimes, because I'm still unclear as to who this man exactly was. But clearly, I guess Michelle had to con him on some mission, but the man was in love with her. and apparently he told her all his secrets, and then those secrets were exposed, and then she ran away. So I'm assuming he was just a part of some mission that she had to do. Well, Michelle doesn't like that this threat is in her life, and Michelle ends up killing him by the end of the episode. So we learn that Michelle is definitely hardcore about her job. I don't know if that was meant for us to question her because she was gung-ho to have to kill this man from her past, but I'm assuming it all had to do with the orphanage and some sort of mission that she was on. Parker also got good development in episode 4 too, because as she's been a sounding board for Michelle when it comes to this mission with Alexander, and Michelle staying close to Alexander, but Parker is enjoying becoming the brains of the operation. She liked that they manipulated Saul, the guy that Alexander ended up killing in this episode, the guy he was trying to get information out of with the encrypted disk. Michelle encourages Parker to take a look at the type of person that Parker is becoming and see if that's the version of Parker that she actually wants to be. And so Parker is a character that has never been out in the field, never had to kill people. In episode 3, that was the first time she was witnessing people being killed, and clearly it hit her hard. In episode 4, we are seeing that maybe she is starting to like the job despite seeing the death. Maybe it had to do with the book that St. George gave her and she was able to bury her feelings within the book. I don't know. But I do like the character development for both of those characters. Another thing added to the plot, as they like to add a lot of things to the plot, is that Alexander's headaches are getting worse. And even though he asks Mora if this has happened to other people experimented on with the brain chip, Mora says it hasn't happened before, but it has. So they're all getting worried that this could be the death of Alexander, because I guess this has happened to others in the past. When these signs started to show, all these headaches, they ended up dead. That could very well happen to Alexander as well. And then we end episode 4 with Alexander at Michelle's house, where he ends up seeing a book that he saw Michelle reading in an earlier episode. He reads part of the book. He sees all these lines that Michelle has been using on him to try and seduce him, to try and develop their relationship further. And so now, once again, Alexander has to question if he can really trust Michelle or not. So the questions of who can and cannot be trusted continue to go on. It's typical spy show stuff, but it's also why I say that it hasn't really gotten to that next level yet. There's a lot of basics from spy shows happening, and I feel that since the show has all these characters that they're trying to develop at once, in a first season that only has 8 episodes, there's just a lot going on, and I don't know if the execution is going great. But it's going good enough. It's a fine show. I enjoy it good enough to keep watching the rest of the season. We're already midway, and I expect the show to pick up as we head towards the finale. So I would recommend the show so far if you don't have anything else to watch, but it's also not going to blow your socks off. That's for sure.